So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us for the latest installment of the Civic Leadership and Service Series for the Maurice A. Ferré Institute for Civic Leadership at Florida International University. I'm Dr. Agatha Caraballo. I serve as the founding director and also as an associate teaching professor in the Department of Public Policy Administration. As those of you that have perhaps attended our sessions before this semester, we're collaborating with the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy on their Policy Lab project as part of our integrative seminar in public policy and service. So our students in this class have been working on several policy issues, and we've been very fortunate to have some amazing speakers come in and talk about issues around civic engagement and leadership, community infrastructure, and social justice. So tonight we have a fantastic panel lined up around Courts Matter. So this session is going to talk about the impact of the courts on voting rights and also just go through the judicial nominations process. With that, I would like to again acknowledge our partners for this evening is the Courts Matters Florida Coalition, the League of Women Voters of Miami-Dade County, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at FIU, the Center for the Administration of Justice at FIU, and as well as our Intercollegiate Public Service Student Association, which is a coalition of student organizations, including the American Society for Public Administration at FIU, the International City and County Management Association at FIU, the Pi Alpha Alpha Honor Society, as well as Students Feeding Miami. I'd like to take this time now to introduce our moderator for this evening and also our incoming program services coordinator for the Ferré Institute, Amanda Knapp, who will also help facilitate the introductions of our guests. Thank you, Amanda. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Caraballo. I'm very excited for this wonderful evening to spend with you of this very important matter of courts in the United States. A lot of us don't understand how important courts in the legislative system is. So with that ado, I would love to introduce our guest speakers. If you would please just give a brief introduction and introduce yourself. Let's start with Melba.
So, hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Melba Pearson. I am the Director of Policy and Programs at the Center for the Administration of Justice. My work is very much focused on prosecutorial transparency. So working with prosecutors' offices around the country using our prosecutorial performance indicators, which are basically a list of different indicators that can talk about the health and the and how progressive your office is. And I don't mean progressive as in left, right, but progressive as in, are you really serving the community with equity? So that's my main role. I'm a former prosecutor, and I also was deputy director of the ACLU of Florida. So just excited for the discussion.
Thank you, Melba. And how about Laura? How are you tonight, Laura?
I'm good. How are you? I'm Laura Rodriguez. I'm with the National Council of Jewish Women, and I am, I guess, the chair of the Courts Matter Florida Coalition. And I'm happy to be here tonight with all of you from FIU and looking forward to this evening. Thank you.
And next up, we have Sammy. Thank you for coming, Sammy.
Thanks a lot. My name is Sammy Moschenberg, and I'm a policy consultant with the National Council of Jewish Women, working on the federal judiciary and the Courts Matter coalitions around the country that NCJW has established. And I am sitting in Alexandria, Virginia, not in front of the Supreme Court. That's just a backdrop. Anyhow, take care. Thank you for having me.
And I just would want to interject, Monica Bestinza, who is the voter services coordinator for the League of Women Voters of Miami-Dade County, was going to be joining us, but she was also in Jacksonville for the ASPA conference and wasn't able to make it back in time to participate. But we're going to talk a little bit about the voter registration drives that we've been doing with the League of Women Voters. And also just want to acknowledge Amy Bloom, who also helped facilitate or coordinating this panel as well.
So on that note, we're going to take some time to have our panelists speak in an open discussion. If you could please explain to the students why this issue is so important, how the courts affect their everyday lives, how the courts affect Florida, FIU. Please just give us your opinions on why students should care about the court system. If you just want to jump in or go in the same order, however you guys are comfortable.
Well, I'm unmuted, so I can start and then I'll mute myself so that I won't make the same argument next time. So I'm sure many of you may be at least getting the alerts on your phones with regards to the fact that we have a Black woman nominated to be our next Supreme Court Justice. And if you've been sitting through the hearings, you may feel some frustration like I do when you have an incredibly qualified woman being questioned by mediocre people and making a big deal out of nothing. But that's a separate issue, and I'm not going to go down that path. But in order for her to get to that point of being in that room and being in the pipeline for the Supreme Court, she had to start somewhere. And it is so important for us to pay close attention to our local courts because they can be the feeder to the Supreme Court. Bear with me. So on the local level, you know, you have your misdemeanor judges, your civil court judges that do lower amounts of financial transactions, right? Then your next step is to get to basically felony court, right? Where you're doing the bigger cases and bigger amounts of money and all of that. Once you get to that point, you can then decide to go to the Court of Appeals here in Florida. You can end up on the Florida Supreme Court because that is the bench that the governor picks from in order to make appointments further on in the process. Also, separately, we have our state court system, but we also have our federal court system. And those federal judges, again, make such critical decisions with regards to whether or not a stop is constitutional. And that creates the law that the prosecutor or the defense attorney relies on if it comes to your case or your loved one's case, right? So they're all setting really critical precedent. And Ketanji Brown Jackson was and still is, until Lord willing, she gets appointed to the Supreme Court. She was a Court of Appeals judge in the federal system. And so all of her experiences, having been a public defender, all of that came to bear so that she can now make rulings that impact people that look like her, people that look like, you know, anyone, just anyone who lives in this country. So that's why it's important to pay attention, like, to these elections, because so often people completely skip over the judges. Or best case scenario, they text me while standing at the ballot box talking about who should I vote for judge, right? And I appreciate that, and I'm happy to give that information, but I really would like people to do that research beforehand, whether it be through court watch programs, go attending different seminars or debates between judicial candidates, and really be engaged in that. Because again, those roles serve as not only a feeder to higher courts, but they impact our day-to-day life in terms of policy and what will be tolerated and what won't be. And I'll leave it there.
Yes, and another big difference between federal and state courts, not just about how they come into being, is that the federal judges serve for a lifetime, which is not true of state court judges, regardless of how the state court judges are selected based on the state. I have my own opinions about that, but in any case, that's the way it goes. So you've got a situation where the president nominates with input usually from the state's senators, and the Senate vets the nominees, and every senator votes on confirmation for every nominee. It's not just the Supreme Court nominees. So you may hear about an exceptional nominee for a position in New York or in California and think, well, that's not Florida, it doesn't have anything to do with me. But in fact, your senators will be voting on whether to confirm that nominee for New York or for California. And of course, all of the courts have an impact, as Dr. Pearson said. Every single court and every judge has an impact on every aspect of our lives, whether it's the quality of the air we breathe, the kind of education we receive, even, who we're allowed to marry, and whether or not we can choose whether to be parents or not. Every aspect of our lives, our workplace situation, whether workplace is free of discrimination, whether it's a safe workplace, is decided by the federal courts. So it has a tremendous impact on our lives. And people are especially focused on the Supreme Court because that's the court that most people know about. And especially now with this extraordinary nominee, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, sitting before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Even as we speak, she's answering questions and somehow being patient and keeping a straight face and not, turning around and saying, some of these questions are a little insulting. But in any case, even as we speak, she's being grilled by the Senate Judiciary Committee. But nominees to the circuit courts, to the district courts, all make decisions that impact our lives for generations to come. Laura?
What Sammy said is 100% correct. The decisions that those justices make and the opinions that they write affect every aspect of our lives. We have created, NCJW in coalition with other groups have created Courts Matter coalitions around the country to address the issue of educating people about the federal judiciary and how it affects everyone's life, as all the ways Sammy described, from gun violence, abortion access, how you want your family to look, your voting rights. All those things are going to be affected by justices who are appointed for lifetime terms. I've also been watching the hearings today, and I did see Judge Jackson get a little irritated once in a while, but she really is. She's standing up there and she's doing a great job, and I think we should all applaud her. And I will send it back to Amanda if she has any particular questions or points that she would like any of us to address.
Yeah, so it seems very difficult in today's age to get younger people involved. I'm very involved with voter registration on Miami Beach, at FIU, and a lot of times it seems that the youth, younger people that can vote 18 to 30s, they don't believe their vote matters, let alone they know what judicial seats are up in the next election or who their senator is or just their mayor. How would you convince our students on today that their vote does matter, and also how can they get involved outside of the Zoom, outside of their class? Melba, want to start again?
Sure. So I want to say, I have to double check the stat on this, but I want to say the last mayoral election for like the city of Miami only had like 15% voter turnout or something really, really abysmal, right? Like 15% of all the registered voters who were eligible to participate in that election turned out to vote. So that really meant like literally a couple thousand people decided who the next mayor was. And to me, that speaks to a bigger issue of people just kind of giving away their power. because they think that their vote doesn't count. So when you look at those numbers, and if everybody said, you know what, my vote doesn't count, I'm just going to stay home, like then you have a small group of people making the decisions for everyone. And you may not be okay with what that outcome is. I think we're seeing a lot of things move through the state legislature that many folks here on this call may not be aligned with, right? May not fit with your values. Well, that's what happens when folks don't vote. Right? If you don't, like you think about the gubernatorial election, however you may feel about, Andrew Gillum and his candidacy, that election was decided by like 30,000 votes. So if you think about the fact that if 30,000 more people turned out, or if 30,000 more people, decided to put one issue to the side, we could be dealing with a whole different scenario right now. We may not be having the same discussion around abortion rights. We may not be having the same discussion about who can protest and who can't. We may not be having the same discussions about what can be taught in school and what can't. We wouldn't be having the same discussions about whether or not we should know who the finalists are or who had applied for the position of president of a university. Right? Like there's so many different things that are in play right now as a result of 30,000 people either not showing up to vote or voting differently. So these are the types of things that folks need to remember when going to the ballot box, that number one, you can't catch amnesia and forget about the ills that happened over the last 4 years, right? Number two, yes, it's exhausting, but you do have to stay engaged. You don't have to do all the hard work yourself. You can be part of organizations like the National Council of Jewish Women, League of Women Voters, NAACP, Florida Rising. I mean, there's so many different, change.org, moveon.org, Color of Change. I mean, there's all these organizations that try to stay engaged around elections and getting the information out there. So folks just have to be very vigilant, see what's coming out, try to show up to different forums where you can meet candidates and ask them questions. The pandemic has given us a gift of being able to do a lot of these things by Zoom. So we can participate or watch how a judge is in a courtroom, right? Because we can go on Zoom and literally watch their court proceedings for that particular day. And if we know that that judge is up on the ballot, we should be sliding through and taking a look at how they treat defendants and defense attorneys in front of them, how they treat the court staff, how they treat witnesses that come in front of them. Are they talking to them any old how, or are they just addressing them with respect? So all of these things affect our day-to-day life, and we have to take an active, like democracy is not a spectator sport. Like we got to roll up our sleeves and get involved.
Yeah, I would build on what Dr. Pearson's saying. Looking at the federal courts again, which is an issue in the Senate race. And one of the things that people never ask Senate candidates about is, so what do you think makes a good judge? What kind of judge would you vote to confirm to a lifetime position? It's one of the most important decisions that a president and senators make because it lasts for a lifetime. A senator isn't going to serve as long as these judges are going to sit in the bench. But I want to take it a little bit of a different direction and talk a little bit about one of the impacts that the federal courts have had that has not been helpful and that we're all feeling. I certainly am feeling it in Virginia, and I know that you're feeling it in Florida. And that is that changes to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1965, when the Congress overwhelmingly passed a Voting Rights Act, which they reaffirmed several times in a bipartisan manner, the Congress wanted certain states, mostly in the South, but not exclusively, who had histories of discrimination, to ask permission of the Justice Department before they made major changes in their voting laws. Made sense, they changed their voting laws, before the Voting Rights Act and disenfranchised many, many people, mostly voters of color. And the thought was, well, going forward, let's just take a look at what you're going to do before you do it. Well, in 2013, in a decision called Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court said, nah, you know what? Civil rights is a done deal. We don't have to worry about discrimination anymore. I don't know what century they're living in, but we don't have to worry about discrimination anymore. You don't have to run these voting rights laws by us. And you know what? If you happen to pass a law that disenfranchises people, those people can sue in court. Of course, that means they have to have been disenfranchised first. So what happened is states all over the country, it became fair game for passing voting restrictions. Everything from denying in Georgia, denying the right for candidates to, or anyone who works for a political party, to give out water to people waiting in hours-long line. In Texas, putting in voter ID requirements that say, get this, even if you go to a state school, your student ID from that state school does not count for registering to vote. But if you have a gun permit, that permit can be used to register to vote. So states all over the country put in really problematic laws that restricted the right to vote or made it more difficult to vote. And the reason was that the Supreme Court opened the door for it. And courts around the country are, for the most part, when people sue and say, hey, this is interfering with my access to vote, courts around the country are saying, nah, it doesn't. So it's a perfect example of how the federal judiciary can make decisions that impact even the most basic tenet of our philosophy, of our democracy, and that is allowing people who are eligible to freely and fairly cast their vote and have that vote freely and fairly counted.
So on that note, I hope this is really inspiring people. Myself, it is. I have to be honest. I do my best to research the judicial candidates. I have to call friends to ask them who to vote for. I do my best, but it's something I'm very passionate about. But Laura, would you like to talk a little bit about the Florida Courts Matter Coalition? Because we do have an upcoming event in the fall, and this is really something great students can get involved with hands-on.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. I just wanted to say really quickly on your questions about how your vote matters and how you can get involved. I would say the very first thing is make sure that every single one of you are registered to vote. That's step one. And then make sure every single one of your friends is registered to vote. And every single one of the people in any club that you are in is registered to vote. And then take on responsibility of educating all about the things that matter to you that probably matter to them also. So that would be where that could be your first step in a leadership kind of way to get people to move to the next step. Our coalition in Florida, we have about 50 or so organizations involved in the, connected to the coalition, everything from the environment to LGBTQ to abortion. I mean, you name it, an organization is connected because, as we've been saying, the federal judiciary affects and our state courts affect every issue that any one of us cares about. Well, I will drop in the chat when I stop talking because I'm not real good at doing all this at the same time. Again, my email, you can email me if you want to get involved with the coalition. We meet on the last Thursday of every month at 10 o'clock in the morning. If you're part of an organization yourself, find out if they're already part of our coalition, and hey, you're a member. We will be having an event in August on campus. It's called a You Be the Judge and it's an interactive event where all the participants get into small groups and actually look at a particular case and discuss and deliberate on that case and how they would actually, how they would adjudicate that case. And that's basically what our event will be, so that you'll be the judge.
Yes, we're very, very excited about that. We are going to move into Sammy's PowerPoint. Dr. Caraballo is going to present the PowerPoint, and Sammy will present for us.
Do we want to take the question that we got in the chat before that, which from Chloe, which,
yeah,
to be honest, I couldn't possibly answer, but
I can't either. So.
I think, in what ways can aspiring lawyers implement justice and equity and concerns of criminal justice reform by becoming a prosecutor? Okay, so it sounds to me that, Chloe, your question is prosecutor versus public defender, who has more impact in the system, right? Of course, I'm going to say the prosecutor because I am a former prosecutor, but also from a practical perspective, I would say prosecutors have the most power in the system because of the fact that they can decide what charges are going to be filed, if charges should be filed at all, whether or not a stop was constitutional, and they have that ability to be able to take the cop to task if they did something that was unconstitutional and inappropriate. Defense attorneys, they play an incredibly important role in the system, but the fact of the matter is their work begins pretty much once charges get filed. They can advocate on behalf of their client and say, listen, don't file charges at all, but you're already in the system, and all they can really do, and not to minimize what they can do, but they're basically being reactive in a lot of ways, right? They have to file motions in response to what the prosecutor did. They have to file motions in response to something that the judge did, right? So they're in sort of a different position. So when it comes to sort of policy change and really changing the landscape of criminal justice, I think prosecutors are the ones that have the most power. And if you as an aspiring student want to get involved, want to become a prosecutor, I think the key thing is, number one, to join local organizations like the National Black Prosecutors Association or the National District Attorneys Association. Many of them have student members or options for students to be able to participate and learn more. And then, interning at a prosecutor's office to see if it's really for you, right? Because you could talk about a lot of things in theory until you've done the work. I mean, you may just do a summer and be like, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, this is not the path for me. Or you could do a summer and be like, whoa, this is the best experience ever. I can't wait to go back and be in the courtroom, which is pretty much what happened to me. Even though my internship was on the defense side, I still saw how things worked, and I realized that that was my calling and where I needed to be. So hope that answers it. And happy to connect offline.
Great question. We have another one in the chat from Angela. She writes, speaking on the impact of courts, when Amendment 4 was passed with bipartisan vote to allow felons to vote, there was action sought by the governor to require legal fines before they could vote. One of the district courts ruled that requirement unconstitutional, but then a circuit court did away with that ruling. So voters are still disenfranchised. Do you see courts working together on this issue in the future, or do you feel that this is just stuck in partisan politics?
It's a great example, Angela. It's an example about how every single stage of the legal process matters. The district court ruled one way, it was appealed, the circuit court ruled another. Sadly, courts are becoming more and more partisan. The last president, I think, looked for people around particular issues and people who could be counted on in terms of certain partisan positions. I don't see that as much with Biden, but I'm certainly, there are those who feel differently than I do and who would take me to task on that. But I don't necessarily see courts working together in the future. We just have to think about the kind of judges we want on these courts. And people on the ground have got to organize and work to figure out ways to get around it. I know there was a campaign, for example, to help some of the formerly incarcerated people pay their fines. I mean, that's one particular way, but there are other ways. There are ways of getting the state legislature maybe to act through advocacy, but it's very hard to see the courts working together. I don't know if someone else has a different point of view. I hope I'm wrong.
No, unfortunately, Sammy, I think you're right. But there's also the logistical aspect, right? So courts can't really necessarily work together because you have two different sets of courts. So you have the federal courts where there was a lawsuit that was brought on one set of grounds saying that this was not only unconstitutional, but contrary to federal law. And then you have the state action. So the state and the feds are two different systems and they can't exactly liaison with each other, right? Because they're looking at different issues, they're looking at different arguments, and they're looking at different laws. All the Constitution, but just again, one more with a federal aim saying that this is running afoul of the Voting Rights Act, this is a much bigger issue, and then the state courts looking at it from a smaller perspective. And again, then you have the whole political liability aspect, right? You have the courts in the federal system where the judges serve for a lifetime. So again, depending on who appointed them, there are certain federal judges who are reliable when it comes to voting rights issues and making sure to advocate for the people impacted. And there's other judges who are reliably the other way. How can we disenfranchise more people, right? So you've got that in play. And then from a state court perspective, again, it all depends. The Supreme Court judges in Florida end up facing a retention vote every couple of years, but they pretty much can hold on to their seats for as long as they want. So the only judges that are really the ones that can be influenced by the fact that they're going to be up for re-election are more of the local judges who don't really have a role in this particular type of case. So really long-winded way of saying Sammy's right, and the courts don't work together partially because they can't, because they're looking at different issues, and partially because of politics.
If I may, I wanted to circle it back to this, the project that the students are working on this semester. So they're working on a series of policy briefs around 3 different topics that were submitted by different elected officials. So they're looking at, for example, AI and transportation, from a federal representative. They were looking at resilient infrastructure as it related to the condo collapse that was submitted by a county commissioner. And they're also looking at career and life skills training for foster children that was submitted by a state senator. But I wanted you all to just kind of perhaps maybe think, maybe touch on the impact of the courts on policy development, implementation. I think of when we used to have the red light cameras, in terms of AI and transportation, and of course the court's decisions that ended up, changing how some municipalities and some communities were able to implement. So how the courts can also change how policy is maybe perhaps developed and then implemented, evaluated. So just happy to welcome any comments in terms of tying it back to, policy in the courts. Sammy, did you want to go into the PowerPoint now? Okay, sounds good. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and share this now. Let me start from the beginning. Can you see that okay?
You get rid of, yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome.
Okay, so we've been talking about the fact that courts matter. And we've talked a little bit about the state courts. And I hope that Dr. Pearson will answer the question that Agatha posed about policy because I know much less about state courts and find it fascinating. Today, we're going to really concentrate on federal courts. Can you change? So you probably know that the US Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. And next slide. And we're going to be looking at the federal court side. There are 13 circuit courts of appeal. Florida is in the 11th circuit. And then there are 94 trial courts that are the US District Court. And that's what we're going to be looking at. And of course, you know, there's one US Supreme Court, which this week I'm feeling thankful about. Can you flip to the next slide? Great. This is a map of the federal circuit courts. You can see down by Florida, the 11th. It includes Georgia and Alabama, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So those cases, any federal case that's appealed goes to that group. So what does it mean that there are all these different circuit courts? In many cases, it means that the circuit court is the last word on cases, and that the 11th circuit may decide differently than the 9th circuit, which is that big circuit out west that includes California and is usually considered more liberal. So for example, if the, let's say the Don't Say Gay bill gets sent up through the federal court system, and the Supreme Court decides they don't want to hear an appeal, and the 11th circuit rules on it in terms of curriculum in schools. I'm just drawing a hypothetical. And I want to also confess that I am not a lawyer. I play one on TV, but I am not a lawyer. And it's soon going to become apparent. But in the 9th circuit, Nevada passes a law like that. And the 9th circuit, because it's more liberal, says, no, this is unconstitutional. So it is possible that different states, based on where they live, are going to have courts that decide differently on their rights. So it's sometimes a patchwork of decisions, and it really does depend where you live. Often the Supreme Court, when they see that the 9th circuit and the 11th circuit voted two different ways, and then the 10th circuit voted a different way, that's often a reason for the Supreme Court to say, you know what, we better weigh in here. So as you look at the cases, next slide, that's fine. As you look at the cases, it's really important to note that you can't even see the blue line for the Supreme Court in this pie graph. And that's because the Supreme Court only hears about 80, 75, 80, up to no more than 100 cases a year. So it's only 1% of federal cases are heard in the Supreme Court. 90% of all federal cases are heard at the district court level, also called the trial level, and nearly 10% at the circuit court level. What that means is that the district courts or the circuit courts are often the last word on our rights because the Supreme Court decides they're not going to take a case. Next slide. So the Supreme Court, this is from an ad that NCJW did a long time ago. It says, they made the bed and now we have to sleep on it. So these are some famous decisions. Some of them are wonderful decisions that we celebrate today, like Loving v. Virginia and Lawrence v. Texas and Roe v. Wade, and others are decisions that are very problematic, like McDonald v. well, McDonald v. Chicago is probably not the best example there, but like Ledbetter v. Goodyear Tire, which came out unfortunately against the idea of equal pay. Citizens United v. FEC, which was a decision that opened the door for all kinds of dark money and campaigns and campaign finance disputes. So these cases are what determine our core constitutional values. And when we say 40 more years, the judges that sit on the court, especially when they're appointed at a relatively young age, because they get to serve for a lifetime, can be on the court for 30 years, sometimes 40 years. President Trump put in some very young judges who were only less than 10 years out of law school. They could be on the bench for 40 years, which is way longer than any president can serve. Next. The Constitution in Article 3 lays out the courts, talks about the courts. It mentions that the Supreme Court, and then it's very vague. It just says there are inferior courts, as Congress may time to time ordain and establish. So there are, the actual makeup of the federal courts was left a lot to Congress. And in the second article, it says that the president nominates by and with advice and consent of the Senate. That has been interpreted to mean that we have a process by which the Senate is the last word. And oftentimes the senators from a particular state have a tremendous impact on who sits on the court. Next slide. Next. So here's what happens. The first thing that happens is home senators, there's a vacancy. Someone's either died or retired and you've got a vacancy on the court. Let's say you've got a district court in Florida with a vacancy. The home senators undertake a process, and that process is pretty loose. Sometimes they have actual commissions with people on it who make recommendations. Other times they just, say, hey, we've got to fill a vacancy, who wants to be a judge? So it's different ways. They send names to the White House to consider for that vacancy. Click again. After that, the president makes a decision. The White House vets these nominees. So it's not like Senators Rubio and Scott are going to recommend somebody and the White House is not going to be bound to appoint them. They're going to consider them. I think that that's always the case, but they probably have their own ideas of who they might want to see in the position. So the president makes the nomination. Next, click. After that, the Senate Judiciary Committee, just as you're seeing on television now with Judge Jackson, holds a hearing and a vote. They issue a questionnaire to the candidate and they do their own vetting as well. And usually the Senate Judiciary Committee takes at least 28 days between the nomination and when they actually hold the first hearing, because they want the answers to the questions and they want to vet the nominee themselves. Click. Next, click. The Senate Judiciary Committee holds hearings. They hear from the nominee, they question the nominee. Sometimes they hear from other people, which is what's going to happen on Thursday with Judge Jackson. And then they vote. They vote whether to approve the nomination and send it to the full Senate or not. Right now, we have 11 Republicans and 11 Democrats, which means there have been some tie votes. When there's a tie vote, the nomination has to get a vote by the full Senate on a discharge petition that takes it out of committee onto the floor. Once the Senate floor gets it, they debate and vote. And it used to be that they could filibuster a nominee and it would require 60 votes in order to break that filibuster. In recent years, that has changed, and now it only requires a simple majority. So you may say to yourself, well, if it only requires a simple majority and that's all it takes to confirm somebody, why do they even bother to go through that extra vote? And it's basically a delaying tactic. Click. Once the Senate votes to confirm, a majority of the Senate votes to confirm, that nominee becomes a judge and is sworn in. With Judge Jackson, what's going to happen is the hearings are this week. They will probably do a committee vote about 7 to 10 days after the hearings end. Hopefully she'll get some support from the Republicans so that it won't be a tie vote, but either way, it will go to the Senate. The Senate will debate and vote. I think you know that the Senate is split 50-50. So if there's a tie vote, the Vice President of the United States, who serves as the President of the Senate, is able to break that tie. We are hoping that, well, there's no reason why Judge Jackson wouldn't get an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote. She's one of the most qualified candidates we've had in years, given by any president. So we're hoping that she'll get more than 50 votes and she will be confirmed. If she only gets the 50 Democratic votes, then Vice President Harris will break the tie. Next slide. Right now, and this is as of March 18th, and it's changing because, believe it or not, while the hearings were going on, the Senate kept getting called away for a vote. The votes they were taking were on judicial nominees. So these numbers are changing by the day. There are 123 current vacancies, and that grows every day as judges decide to retire or they die. And those are 24 circuit judges, 95 district judges, 2 in federal claims and 2 in international trade courts, which are federal courts, but not courts that are mentioned under Article 3 of the Constitution. We have 34 nominees who are pending on the floor, and I think 2 of them were voted out today, so that's 32. And we have, including even those non-Article 3 courts, we've had 50 confirmations, and actually before I logged on to this Zoom, that was 51. So President Biden has been very successful. Part of that is helped along by a Democratic Senate, but President Biden has been very successful in getting his nominees confirmed. Next slide. And again, you can contact your senators. You certainly should if you have an opinion about how they should vote on Judge Jackson, and let them know how you feel. Never think that a senator is a hopeless case, or that a senator is always going to agree with you, so why bother to contact that person? It's exactly what Dr. Pearson said about voting. People think it doesn't matter. People think, oh, Senator Rubio doesn't want to hear from me. I'm not going to make a difference. You always let elected officials know how you feel. No elected official should stand up and take a vote and believe that everyone in their state, in their district, in their town agrees with them. They need to hear from everyone. By the same token, if you agree with a senator, if you think Marco Rubio's doing great and you always agree with him, which is fine, thank him. You thank your senators for voting the way you'd like them to vote, because a lot of people are going to express their disappointment and give them a hard time. So you always want to thank elected officials who agree with you. I just want to close by saying one of the things that Biden has done that I think is incredibly important, and more so than any other person who's been in the presidency, is he has diversified the bench in a way that no one else has. He took a look at the federal judiciary, saw that it was primarily white males who come from a prosecutorial background and not the kind that Dr. Pearson's talking about, and or corporate law firms. And he said, we've got to achieve some balance here. And he has appointed more women, more people of color. He appointed the first Muslim Article 3 judge. He appointed the first openly gay circuit court judge. Actually, there's a second one who is going to be confirmed probably this week. Judge Allison Nathan, and has really diversified the federal bench. And equally importantly, to demographic diversity, in other words, race, ethnicity, religion, any of those things, gender, equally important is experiential and professional diversity. So it matters that Ketanji Brown Jackson is a Black woman, the first Black woman ever to be nominated for the Supreme Court and hopefully to sit on the Supreme Court. But it also matters that she's the first public defender. She will be the first public defender to sit on the Supreme Court. Civil rights attorneys have been nominated to positions. People who, Nina Morrison, who was head of the Innocence Project, was nominated to a federal court post. People with all kinds of diverse backgrounds have been nominated, and it's changed and reshaped the federal judiciary so that everybody who comes before the federal courts can take a look at the person sitting behind the bench and say, I at least have a shot at a fair trial. And that the federal judiciary reflects the totality of this country. So with that, I just want to close and thank you for including me, and thank all of you in advance for becoming educated court watchers and for expressing your views about the kinds of fair and independent and diverse candidates we need to see on the federal bench.
Oh, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I need to learn more. But we would like to open up the floor now to students to ask questions. You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. But we are encouraging questions.
And while folks are thinking about their questions, just circling back to Agatha's question earlier about courts and policy and sort of the impact that they have, I'm going to give an example on that because I'm all about always bringing receipts. So the Supreme Court of Florida, sua sponte, meaning that there was no pending matter, there wasn't a pending case or anything like that, decided to be like, let's look at continuing legal education credits. And basically they came out with I wouldn't say like, basically it's like a ruling that said, if you are going to a CLE program where there are requirements with regards to diversity of the panel. So in other words, the American Bar Association, if you go to any of their continuing legal education programs, they have a requirement that the panel is diverse. You can't just have all white men sitting up there. You can't have all white women. You can't have all Black people, right? But you have to have diversity of thoughts, of viewpoints, and all of that. Because the fact the American Bar Association mandates a requirement that panels have to be diverse, we can no longer get CLE credits in Florida for attending American Bar Association programs. So that, and how that came about is basically the governor calls the chief justice, be like, hey, this is my agenda, this is my issue, right? And then they take it up and move on from there. And that is a perfect example of how the courts can affect policy, because now we have to think through, okay, if we're trying to do a panel in Florida and we're trying to offer people those continuing legal education credits so that you can continue to be a lawyer, because every 3 years you have to report to the Florida bar and say, listen, I've completed 33 hours of continuing education. Other states have different requirements, but like DC has no requirements, which is amazing. But anyway, attorneys you have to get that. You have to get CLE credits in order to continue practicing law. So now you have a situation where you either A, go with an organization to get your credits and just hope that, it's going to be acceptable, but knowing that they may not necessarily mandate diversity in their panels, or go to one where you're going to get a spicy debate with regards to particular issues, but know that you're not going to be able to get credit for it. And so how does that now impact what attorneys decide to specialize in, what issues they decide to take up or whatever? Because again, you're not getting the full picture. You're not getting the full story. You're only getting the viewpoint from one particular segment. So want to kind of give that context.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. What are your thoughts about the line of questioning for Judge Jackson? More about communicating party grievances, discrediting her, or challenging her? What are your thoughts? Anybody?
So I think that number one, I think a lot of it is sort of like the Festivus airing of grievances, right? Because they know that they have a captive audience, so to speak. And so now's the time to, posture and be like, our nominees were treated so harshly. Oh my God. And we're going to take the higher road and we're not going to do the same thing, even though we're going to jack up her time and not let her really talk about issues that people need to learn about, or give information that the senators can use to vote, right? So it's very hypocritical. So there's that aspect. There's a small pocket of folks that are trying to discredit her, right? But again, looking hypocritical because that's pretty much the same composition of folks that voted for her to become a federal judge to begin with. Because remember, she's in the pipeline for the Supreme Court, but she had to go through the same confirmation process to become a federal judge. So they already, those same, that same party breakdown voted for her to move forward. She was qualified enough to be a federal judge, but now all of a sudden she's not, doesn't have enough qualifications to be on the Supreme Court. Yeah, that doesn't hold water. So that's more of the extreme fringe, like your Ted Cruz's, your Hawleys, who've got something else that they want to prove or want to position themselves for 2024. There's some of that going on. And then lastly, yes, there are some folks trying to challenge her in a lot of ways. But again, I think it's more about politics, throwing red meat to the base, because they know that her confirmation is pretty much a foregone conclusion. So all they can do is try to sully the president. They want to sully anybody who's progressive, but I don't think that they're going to really have much of an impact overall.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
I posted and alluded to it earlier in the chat, but Melba, if you wouldn't mind telling them about your series, Mondays with Melba, and some of the recent interviews you've had with some judges that are looking to keep their seats.
Yeah, thanks. So every Monday, I do Mondays with Melba at 6 p.m. You can watch it on Facebook Live. You can watch it on Twitter Live now. I've been expanding over the course of the last few months. So you can watch it on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And then I also upload it to Instagram TV on midweek, as well as to my podcast, which can be heard on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, and Anchor. So basically anywhere you really like to get your podcast, you can get the Resident Legal Diva podcast as well. So this month, it being Women's History Month, and of course coinciding with the confirmation hearings of Judge Jackson, I decided to interview 4 Black female judges that are up for re-election this August. Those 4 judges include Maisha Darrow, who was the judge I spoke to yesterday. Last week, I spoke to Julie Harris Nelson, and the first week I spoke to Judge Ayanna Harris. Next week, I speak with Judge Shaka Ihekola. So all of these ladies are going to be on the ballot in August. So I encourage all of you, I'm going to drop my socials in the chat. You can go through and look at the past interviews I've done with them and you get to know them a little bit more. If you're in a position that you can donate to their campaign, please do so, because I can tell you, as someone who ran for office, campaigns are not free. And people don't talk about that enough, right? If you want to see people that actually reflect your values, who have like worked a day in their life, right? Those aren't the folks that have $300,000 that they have in their bank account that they can just dump into an election. Like those aren't the folks, right? If you want people who are actually up in Tallahassee that are opining on education policy, who are actually teachers during the year, right? If you want people that are actually really impacted by these issues, you've got to donate to campaigns, because that's the only way they can get their message out and be able to get elected and be able to fight against, entrenched institutional entities that have been serving for 20, 30, 40 years and haven't done anything for our community. So got to put that out there. And judges can't ask for donations like that. So at least in Florida, I can't speak to other states, but so they're never going to come out and be like, hey, I need more money for signs, as opposed to like your state rep who will go all out begging you for money, right? So just want to give that context, but I'm going to drop my contact info in the chat. Definitely check it out. And if you have questions, or you are like, hey, I'd love to see you cover this topic on future Mondays with Melba, just hit me up and let me know.
I just want to also direct in the chat, Laura just posted the Progress Florida Toolkit, so definitely you can check out that Google document. And Laura, if you wanted to add anything about that?
No, that's it. I was just going to say you can check out that toolkit for any social media ideas, etc., for supporting the confirmation of Judge Jackson.
Well, I know we are coming towards the end of our program, so I do want to just take this moment to thank our fantastic panelists. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Sammy. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Amanda, for facilitating. We have maybe a few minutes if there's any last questions, but in the meantime, I hope that everyone will join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our speakers. And I also want to take one more opportunity to thank our amazing partners for this series, and in particular for this session, the Courts Matter Florida Coalition, the League of Women Voters of Miami-Dade County, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at FIU, the Center for the Administration of Justice at FIU, and the Intercollegiate Public Service Student Association. And at that, any final thoughts? And again, just my sincere thanks again, just for some amazing information. It really was very informative. So if there are no further, again, I just want to thank you again. We will be posting this on the Ferré Institute's YouTube website shortly. But in the meantime, just don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns. Our students will be presenting their policy briefs over the next 2 weeks, same time, same Zoom. So I hope that you'll come and support and provide some feedback. And thank you again for taking time for joining us this evening.
And register to vote if you haven't.
Absolutely.